Good morning if you're in Colorado. Good afternoon if you're Central or East Coast. My name is Patrick Heister with BizPsych, and we want to welcome you to the third part of our webinar series for our HR practitioners and other attendees. I see we have some consultants that are joining the broadcast today, so we really want to join you and welcome you to this third in our series of webinars on organizational assessments and interventions. Just a couple of housekeeping. All of the attendees will be on mute throughout the broadcast, so you can communicate with us through the chat section in the bottom. You should have a little screen that allows you to ask questions. We'll try to do our best to look at those and then just answer questions verbally as we get them. So hopefully that works for everyone. And we are just going to go ahead and get started with the webinar. I want to just say a little bit about this series. We devised this series to engage, especially our HR practitioners, in looking at the process of doing organizational assessments. In our time, we have conducted a number of comprehensive organizational assessments in dealing with a variety of issues that come up for teams, organizations, facilities, basically anything that's impacting human behavior or systems in the workplace. So we've divided up the series into 4 different parts, sort of along the lines of the types of organizational assessments that we conduct. And our hope is that it will engage especially our HR professionals and consultants in thinking about when they have issues that come up in the workplaces, what are their resources internally, what are some of their practices, and what are they doing to help them make some decisions about some of the best ways to move forward when they're facing organizational issues. I also want to introduce my colleague Marcia Kent, who's the president of BizPsych at Minds & Associates, who will be joining me as always in the presentation today.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon. It's nice to be here again.
Marcia's waving if you can't see her.
All right. Last time that we did our webinar, I was joined by my colleague, Dr. Bob Minds, who is also our CEO, and we really focused on the art of an effective organizational development assessment. And the things that we talked about are all the challenges and considerations associated with doing an organizational development assessment. And one of the key pieces is really being clear on who needs to be included and how to design your assessment, which has everything to do with the interview process, the types of questions that are going to be asked, really being specific about the information that you're mining for. Oftentimes we're presented with the symptoms, but our challenge and our goal for doing an assessment is to dig to the root cause and understand the systemic issues. And then there's considerations about how to present the information to the participants, thinking about who will be included in that. And we spent quite a bit of time talking about some of the challenges that occur in the process of doing an organizational development assessment. So that was what we covered last time, and one of the aspects of any effective organizational development assessment is you collect all this rich, useful data, and then what do you do with it? And that's what we're going to focus on more specifically today.
One of the practices that we've engaged in all of these webinars so far is we made the decision early on to present specific cases, actual cases that we've worked on, as a way of highlighting some of the theory or the concepts that we're talking about. So we emailed those out at the very beginning of the series to the entire list of people that signed up, but we can't keep up with everyone who joins each webinar. So we are going to just briefly review 3 of the cases that we've been using consistently throughout. We're not going to spend a lot of time. We have these written up. They are very generic, so we've genericized them, if that's an English word, to protect the identity of the clients. So they're going to sound pretty general, and that's by design. If you're interested, you can email us, and we can send you a more comprehensive write-up of the whole situation. But just briefly, here are the 3 cases that we've been presenting.
And we intentionally chose these 3 case studies because there's enough nuances and differences in each one of them that we thought it'd be helpful to have them as a base of comparison. So the first one had to do with a specific facility that was part of an organization that had multiple campuses and facilities, and each one of those had their very own unique culture. We were asked in this particular situation, a task force of the leadership team had come together, and they had concerns about the amount of turnover that they were experiencing, which was very high at the time. And they really wanted to understand what were all the contributing factors that was making it so difficult for them to retain employees, especially after doing some exhaustive executive searches and then only to find out that people were still leaving the organization. And because of that, it was having a negative impact on their staff. It was making it very difficult for people to transition the new leaders and onboard them effectively, and then as soon as the staff was starting to get to know them and understand their management and leadership style, then there was another void again and another negative impact of having to find another person to replace their last supervisor, manager, and leader. And so we were asked to understand what they could be doing differently in their recruitment efforts to help minimize turnover and to help identify what was happening in the communication process and how to more effectively onboard new executives.
Great. The second case that we presented is a direct service department, so an organization that provided direct service to clients that was experiencing severely compromised relationships and accountability issues. So it had to do with this department that actually had 3 distinct groups of employees working together, a very sort of unusual design where there were actually 2 somewhat separate organizations that were working together to provide this service. It was a traditional hierarchical organization that had a basis for title, education, and level of expertise. However, there were 2 separate groups of professionals. There was a specific provider group and then another professional support and administrative group. There had been numerous unresolved conflicts in terms of leadership, including leadership concerns between different team members in the department, as well as significant systems inefficiencies that were problematic with workflow. So there were a lot of complaints about who was doing what and who shouldn't do what, and it was complicated by the fact that there were these 3 distinct groups that had different reporting hierarchies, and as well there were 2 different unions representing some of the professional administrative folks within the group, 2 separate unions. So that made it complicated. So we were asked, actually invited by the internal organizational development person from the organization who had made some attempts to intervene in this group, to come in as a neutral, objective party to see if we could get to the root of what some of the issues were and make some recommendations for resolving both relationships and the problems with work accountability specifically.
And excuse me. The last one, which was, I think, one of our more interesting organizational development assessments that we've done, started over a year ago, and it's still ongoing. And the original invitation was to help a group of owners that were part of a professional private practice to determine if one of their owners was actually a good fit for the professional practice. And in the process of helping them with that particular decision, a number of other dysfunctional issues started to become apparent, including an impaired CEO. They had bylaws that were out of date. They had financials that hadn't been reconciled. They had a toxic manager that was putting the organization at significant risk for potential lawsuits. And so what started out as a specific, this is a great example of what starts out as a presenting problem as you pull back the layers, really gave a very interesting view on all these other systemic problems that were related to the consternation that was occurring amongst the owners, and then to understand all the other contributing factors. So what started out as a very small scope assessment has turned into one of our biggest organizational development interventions over the last 2 years, actually, and it's still going.
And I would just add, Marcia, that we selected the first 2 because they're fairly classic in terms of our typical assessments. We go through this very typical process and end up with some recommendations that actually had interventions to help the situation. The third situation that Marcia just described was completely different, and I think shows the need to have some flexibility, adaptability.
Right.
It actually started backwards, started in some ways with the intervention and led to some of the assessment.
Correct. That's a good way to put it, because it started out as a consultation around a specific intervention that they needed help with, and then from there it actually moved into the arena of needing a full-blown assessment.
So we're just going to refer to these cases specifically today, so we wanted to give you some background. And again, if you want some a written write-up, we're happy to email that to you. We've kept them very generic to protect the organization. So today's session, we are focusing on the fine art of report writing. So a lot of HR professionals are conducting their own assessments in the workplace, certainly around workplace violence, at least harassment investigations, if not, conflict and team dysfunction. And some of those are somewhat straightforward in what they're looking for and what we're answering. But the question often comes up, how do you collapse, if you're doing interviews with a number of employees, how do you really honor the different information that you get from individuals? How do you collapse that data and effectively utilize that? So we recognized and we're sort of alerted to the fact that some people might have been a little bit confused at the title of today's topic, the fine art of report writing. So we thought we'd just ask you straight off, what do we mean by report? So when we ask that question, so I'm going to see if I can launch our poll here and have you answer this. So those of you that are at a keyboard, please see if you can answer back to us. So I'm going to launch this. Hopefully you see the responses to what do we mean by report. And then we will see as you're answering this. Okay, so we've got a percentage of those that are on that voted. We're holding at 29%. Maybe some people aren't at their keyboards. I hope you all can see it, but since we're getting some responses, it must be working. Okay, we're up to 43%. I wanted not to set this up too much. I was just going to ask you, what do we mean by report? I queued it up, but you're very adept. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. I'll give you another second, but probably those that have voted will have voted. So, and we got 100% correct answer. So 100% of those answered said that the answer is useful feedback about the assessment. So that's clearly what we're talking about. You've got a bunch of data. You've talked to a bunch of folks in the organization, and so now we want to know, what do we do with that that really is going to help this organization? So thanks for taking the poll. We have a couple other ones just to make sure that you're still awake, since we can't hear from you or see you, which Marcia and I are both used to a lot of interaction. So we're going to talk about the report. What do you do with the data from the assessment? First of all, it's comprehensive. So how does it include all the facets and angles impacting the situation? So we're talking about there are people issues, but there's also systems issues. There's history. There's current events, current situations, sometimes specific, very specific events that have occurred. In one case that we talked about, there had been a strike of the union probably 7 years prior to us coming into this organization. That history was still impacting in a fairly strong way what was happening today. So how do you make the report comprehensive in taking all of those angles into consideration? How do you give back data that's representative? So how do you accurately represent all the interests, perspectives, voices that are collected in the data? So in most of the assessments that we conduct, we're doing what we call semi-structured interviews. So we've come up with a list of questions, and we talked about this in the last webinar that we did, what specific questions, and we're basically having a discussion with people about those. So we get a huge, wide-ranging amount of data with hugely different perspectives. How do we honor all of those perspectives and report them back without literally quoting people? And then how do we not over-align with a certain faction or a certain voice, employees against management or management against employees, administration? How do we represent all of those fairly and clearly? We want to give a report that's informative. So we want to give the client some of the information that they're looking for. So all along the process, we need to be very clear with the organization, or if, let's say, you're conducting an organization internally, what is it that we really want to find out? What's going to help us move forward? What are the questions that we want answered? And a lot of times, especially for us as external consultants, this is a very guiding principle, because we could come in with our own values about what we think an organization should be like or should be doing. And the organization might have very specific goals for what they need from a team, for a facility, or for a group. So how can we be giving back the information that the organization is going to be looking for and value? Then, in addition to that, how can that information be educational? So can we provide information that's either new information? A lot of times it's not. To be frank with you, a lot of times we do an assessment and people say, yeah, I'm not really surprised by this. They've heard about it. But what we really try to do is to give the information back in a new light or from a new perspective, in a way that maybe they haven't considered before. It really considers all of the angles. And we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about how we do this. But in some ways, this report back to the organization should be educational. It should somehow give them some perspectives that help them solve this or view the situation in a different way.
Yeah, what I would add to that is I think that even though the information might be affirmative or might validate what they've already had a sense about, because we do an analysis of the data, we help them understand why things aren't going the way that they are, what the contributing factors are, and where there might be systemic issues that they weren't aware of. What they experienced were the symptoms of people acting distressed, acting out, feeling frustrated. We might hear about complaints of poor morale. And so that part might be validated about the work environment. But I think what the reports really bring to it is a much deeper level of understanding of why things are going the way that they are.
Great. And then lastly, this is really a soapbox of mine. The entire intervention from the beginning, and we need to be thinking about this, and I'm sure that we mentioned this in our very first webinar, this needs to be a constructive and useful process. And one of, I kind of follow the medical motto, do no harm. And I believe seriously that organizational consultants have and sometimes do harm to organizations. So it's not useful to go in and stir up a lot of trouble and find out a lot of information if the organization isn't going to be prepared to do something with that. Mm-hmm. And what we found is that there are situations that we go in where people have said, oh, yeah, we've done this before, we've been asked our opinion. They didn't do anything with that information. So people are reluctant to open back up again, because what's the point of answering, some of your darker sort of opinions about what's happening in an organization if you feel like it's not going to be useful. So the entire process constantly has to be constructive. We need to be checking in with the organizers of the project that they have some intention of getting back to folks, circling back with them, and letting them know what the results were and what they're going to do about it. We're going to be talking quite a bit more about that. So we have another poll, and I've got to see if I can get to this. All right, so I'm going to select the second poll for you today, and this poll asks you, who should receive the report? So we've kind of defined a report as giving back the data, but who do we give that to specifically in the organization? So here's your choices now. Everyone involved, whomever's paying us for the assessment, each situation may be different. The sponsors or key stakeholders, the CEO or president of the organization should get that. doing pretty well. We've got about 43% of people voting now. And I'll give you just a few more minutes. So once again, we may not, everyone may not have access to the keyboard, is my guess. We've moved up to 71%. So we've got about 17%, and I'm going to see if I can share this with you. We've got about 17% saying that everyone should get the report back, about 17% saying that sponsors are key stakeholders, which is really a great answer and is most often true. But we're going to say that the actual correct answer here is the third answer. Each situation may be different, and we're going to give you some examples of that. So we're going to talk a little bit about this whole idea of the report can be a pretty sensitive issue. So we want to talk about that more in depth. Let's see if I can share this with you if you see what the results were. Really, each situation may be different. So the closest answer to that, sponsors or key stakeholders, obviously is it's important. But we want to consider that this is very sensitive data. So we've gone in and something that we should clarify that was brought up in the last webinar is that that all the folks that we interview in the assessments that we do, we say that this is anonymous information, which can be very tricky. So we try to allow people to be as open as they need to be and say that when we report back, the information is going to be generalized to them. So this is very sensitive information. It can be very critical of certain people in the organization, certain leaders. It can be very sensitive data, so that needs to be considered. Who are the decision makers? So as I said, we want to make sure that something's going to be done with this data when we get it. Who are the folks that are going to make a decision about what's going to be done ongoing? Who are the key stakeholders? So, we have to consider the clients. There are times that we've actually suggested getting some feedback specifically from clients or different departments who are sort of the recipients of the services or coordinating with the people. What are the potential outcomes that we might be looking for? And what could be unintended consequences? So some of the information that we may share back may create some changes that people didn't know of going in. And to be frank, once again, there are a couple assessments that we've done that have led to some leadership changes when it was really highlighted that that was something that was needed. Well, that may be something that those leaders, didn't really see coming. So there can be unintended consequences. So we need to consider all of those factors in looking at who gets the report and how we decide what happens with the information. And each situation is going to be different. And so we're going to talk about some of the specifics of what we've come up with in our case study. So if you remember back to the case studies, in the first case that Marcia described about this general facility, you want to go ahead and address that?
Sure. In this case, because of the turnover at the leadership level, they actually formed an executive task force that was made up of different leaders throughout the organization at some of the facility levels and at corporate. And so this committee actually interviewed us. They were the ones that contracted for the assessment, and the report went back to this special task force.
Okay, and so in the second one, which as we described was rather complicated, and this is part of the reason we chose this case in particular, we were actually first contacted, as I said, by the internal organizational development consultant who had worked in this department along with a union representative to try to make some changes. Both of those folks were kind of rejected by the group themselves. So when they brought us in, they referred us to the office administrator of the group. That's really who we initially coordinated everything with. However, it was very clear from the get-go that the information that we received in the report was going to have to go to that office administrator of the particular facility that we were working with. That person's boss, who was a regional administrative, the leadership of the provider group. So I said there were two different kind of organizations, and one was a provider group. So the leadership of that group, as well as the regional leadership of that group, and then the professional services manager was included in that reporting. But very important along the process, and this is something always to consider for any of you who are working with union environments, the union representatives, so the union leadership, it was essential that they be included in the whole process, in the design of the assessment, in getting the report back, in the decision making. So that was a situation that initially they actually weren't paying for the report. They weren't in on part of the initial referral, although they had to give their buy-in. But it was really essential to pull them in, not only because the leaders felt that way, but to get buy-in from this whole group, that union representation had to be there. So always an important consideration.
And with the last group, with the professional practice group, what was interesting about this is originally the people that came to consult with us were the board members, the owners, select board members, and then the current CEO. And so we worked on that decision-making process about board members and owners being a particular fit or a good fit. And when it became apparent that the CEO was impaired, that CEO had to take a leave of absence, and they brought in an interim CEO who eventually became the current CEO. So this process really unfolded over time. And there was a report that was done halfway through based on input from the managers, but that information was never really reported back to the managers. It was used by the owners so they could understand where the organization had been and where it needed to go from the manager's perspective. So that was really unique. We've never done one like that before.
So again, you can see that actually the report and getting the data back is actually part of the intervention. And figuring out a way to do that, again, that's going to be useful and constructive, obviously takes some consideration for us to be fluid and adept and to be looking at the systems issues and what's going to have the greatest leverage of impact for the greatest good in the project. And that is, in our experience, not straightforward.
Okay, then we move on. This is now getting to the nuts and bolts of what to include in the report. And the first thing that Patrick and I will do in a report is we'll include a statement of the problem. Now, this might seem straightforward at first glance, and in reality, we just got done spending 2 hours with the leadership group trying to clarify a presenting problem. So, and we never even finished the conversation to really pull out and tease out what is the problem. So it's important to us that we start every report out by identifying, here's what the problem is. One of the things that comes out of our data analysis is having a good understanding of what are the current strengths in the department and what are the areas of concern. We always want to be able to identify for our clients what they have currently that's working well. It's important to focus on that as an area of positive momentum, and also to give a full balanced perspective that even though there might be concerns and problems, that not to lose sight of the fact that there could be some wonderful qualities and characteristics of a team that we don't want them to lose sight of. We also will quantify the data, and for example, if we hear concerns about increased levels of stress or decline in trust levels, we want to be able to anchor that somehow. So it's not uncommon for us to have some quantitative data where on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 9, we might ask participants to identify their current trust levels with their leadership. We might ask them to identify their levels of stress within the organization or in their department, and so that's not uncommon either. We will include contextual information because, as Patrick talked about that other situation where there had been a strike 7 years ago, if there's still unresolved conflict or residual left over that, it's important If a department has gone through a lot of turnover, that might be a contextual piece of information that's impacting the way people are currently feeling. It could be that a department has undergone major reorganization around the reporting structure, or maybe they've recently had to learn how to do things completely different with the implementation of a new software program that everyone's struggling to learn how to start using. So we always want to provide contextual information to help give a perspective to what some of the issues are that are happening in a department. And from all of that, then we move into doing an analysis. And that's taking our knowledge and expertise about human behavior, about business issues, about systems issues, workflow efficiencies, that we put all of that together and will provide an analysis of, based on what we've heard, what we've learned, areas of strength, areas of concern, here's what we think is going on, and here are the contributing factors. And from there, we're able to give our client a list of recommendations, a list of actionable items that they can take to help improve things and move groups forward. And those recommendations will vary significantly, from even starting with reporting the data back to executive coaching for specific individuals. There might be some training recommendations on skill development. It could also include some real, what we would call, honest assessments, where they really have to look at certain people that are on a team and whether they're really contributing members, whether or not they're a good fit for the environment, and what we call an honest inventory assessment. So the recommendations will vary, and every report will include some recommendations to implement to move things forward. It's important for our clients to know, well, if we're going to spend all this time and money and effort, what would be indicators of success? How would we know that things are improving? What ought we be looking at to know that we're moving in the right direction? And then we can also help them assess and give them a compelling reason, if you will, to implement the recommendations based on the return on investment. What will it cost the organization to do nothing? What can they anticipate will be the further pain threshold that they'll experience? What can they expect in terms of spending the money and the time and the effort of things improving? What might be the additional recruitment and training costs if they continue to lose people? So we want to give them some sense of what the return on investment will be in the report.
I would add just a couple things. That my opinion is that the better we get at this, Marcia and I at least, in BizPsych, our division, that the more we try to tune into the individual clients and what it is that they want. So what are we going to emphasize? All of these aspects, I think, are important in the report. Some clients really want to focus on the data. What did people say? We want to find out what people said. Some clients, frankly, it's not so important. They know it. They've heard it. They want to really focus on our analysis or our recommendations. I mean, I think recommendations are almost always important. But I think the better we get at it, the more we have an ongoing discussion about kind of what we're finding, so that we can gear that report to a way, again, that's useful and constructive to them, and not maybe as academic as we used to do when we started out, which was to kind of try to dot all our I's and cross the T's in terms of including all of this. I think we're more in that unfolding process and finding out what's going to be constructive and useful to people in giving them the report. And the other thing is that we've run up against situations where we're getting close to the final stages. We're writing the report, and we realize that there's some important information or questions that we need to answer to really give them effective recommendations or an effective report. So we've gone back to them and say, we need to do a couple more interviews, or we need to find out this particular information from you. And it's really important. We're pretty deadline driven, and we'll talk about the time frame, but we try to honor the time frames. So we need to be putting together the report ahead of time enough that if there are questions that need to be answered, we can go back to the organization and to get those.
And that ties in nicely to understanding what format they are looking for. And it's not a one-size-fits-all. And I would say that over the years, Patrick and I have really learned to adapt the format of how we present the information. So how much information do they want? Sometimes, as Patrick said, we just want to cut to the chase, help us understand what's going on and what to do about it. Sometimes they want more information. So it really depends on what the need is. If they have already done their own version of an internal OD assessment, it might be possible that they don't need as comprehensive of a report. Who's the report going to? That might impact what type of a format. If it is going to the CEO or the president or people that are extremely high up in the organization, they might have a different set of expectations about how thorough and comprehensive the report, the format needs to be. And it always comes down to time and money in terms of the format. The more work that we have to put in on our end, the more comprehensive, if we're doing multiple almost chapters, if you will, or multiple sections, as you'll see in one of our reports, that includes a lot of contextual information, or if they decided that the scope was really large and we had to interview every person in the department and other recipients of that department's services, it's going to be a more comprehensive report. And some of our clients have said, you know what, we just simply want some type of an executive summary. You know, we want it not to exceed more than 4 or 5 pages, and that's clear. So time and money will have a lot to do with the specific format.
The one thing I don't think we've mentioned yet, but our typical recommendation, especially if we're working with a large group of people, even some of the smaller groups of people, is we have tended to recommend against giving a written report to everyone who we interview in the situation. And that's always tricky because I think people, we want to honor that people want feedback from the session. And as a matter of fact, I'm probably preempting, but one of the things we'll talk about is one of our recommendations is always to circle back to all the people that were interviewed. However, we have typically not recommended a written report to those folks because we're dealing with some pretty contentious situations where there's a lot of different opinions and perspectives and sometimes some pretty severe conflict. And as I said, this is pretty sensitive data, and you just don't know what's going to happen with that written data in terms of lawyers, or even if it's just sort of left around or shown to other people or news agencies or anything like that. So we are very careful about that written information and who that goes to. There are a few situations that we've been specifically asked to write an executive, like a one-page executive summary that goes, let's say, to the whole department or the whole team. And we'll do that, and we'll also reinforce that this is your sort of personal information, and we want you to use this delicately.
Right. And even in those situations, we might distribute a one-page summary and ask to collect it back at the end of the debriefing meeting. So there are departments that are very protective over their own image, if you will, within an organization, and so they don't want this information floating out. And so we have to be sensitive to that. And we're going to go to the next slide and talk about some of the different types of formats. And really, I think what it comes down to is, to some extent, formal and more informal. So a formal report is bound, it's spiral bound, or it's put together in a notebook. It will have a table of contents, will include charts and graphs, recommendations, and it's not uncommon for us to have addendums to help illustrate further concepts of some of what we're sharing in the analysis. And those reports can be anywhere from, 15 pages to 35 pages. And there's a lot of detailed information. A more informal report would be an executive summary that includes just the key highlights, the most salient points. It might not even include the recommendations. It might just talk about, here's what we found. And sometimes we'll consolidate the information just by showing some charts and graphs. So we're going to show you some slides that give some examples of what this looks like. This was a graph that was done for a very extensive organizational development assessment, and there were so many themes in terms of concerns that people reported. We thought it would be more effective to simply illustrate that by including a graph. So you can look at the bottom, and that shows the types of concerns that people brought to our attention during the interview process and how pervasive or acute the pain thresholds were for people. And this, I thought, was a really effective way because that was one of our more extensive reports that we did. And this was used for the staff in the debriefing meeting we just popped this slide up so people could actually get a visual to see what the data showed.
So I think we didn't give any other written information to this entire team, but we gave this graph. And from that, there were a lot of questions. There was a lot of discussion that could be generated about either what does this mean, or how do we view this, or we can check in with them about their perception. So again, this was a nice a way of leading a report out meeting with the entire group. And this had been, I think, in the report, and I think they requested that we use this to report to them.
The next two slides would be examples of what we might put in an addendum. A lot of times we're dealing with assessments because of the amount of organizational change that has happened within a department or a company. And so we'll talk about the change process, we'll talk about the impact that it might be having. And to illustrate that, we might include a graph like this in the addendum that shows how people deal with organizational change. And if you go to the next slide, this is really where it comes into play, where, there you go, that's perfect, where we're going to talk to them about people on a team that are the early adopters, people that embrace change, people that are the cheerleaders and the supporters, and that what we might want to encourage them to think about is forming a tipping point so that they can use their informal leaders to create a tipping point team to help move change forward, and where that critical mass will occur. Oftentimes what we want our clients to understand is that they spend a lot of time and energy focusing on the cynical people or the saboteurs. And that's really not where the action is at. So if we can put a chart like this into the addendum, then we've got a visual aid to talk to our clients about. And this would be a good example of a contextual issue that we want to pull into the report about the change process and how that might be impacting their particular team.
I think we shared this information in one project that we worked on in particular, where there was an organization that had a very large group in a facility that they wanted to assess. As a matter of fact, I think this is our first example. However, the organization could not afford the time for us to interview all of those people, so we had shared this information about the tipping point, and they actually used the concept of the tipping point team to try to select the folks that we would interview in particular in the group as a representative group. And in that context, the tipping point team isn't always the most positive, rah-rah cheerleader employees, but it's those that have the greatest influence.
Right, and in that situation, we specifically wanted to be sure to include some of the more skeptical and cynical people that were in the organization and some potential saboteurs, so we can understand what it looked like from their perspective. And this is a helpful tool to identify what are some of the characteristics of people that would be on that change curve.
Again, just to underscore the point of our sharing some of these graphs, that these are some of the things that we will include in the report that are, I think, the reason we're getting paid to do this is that we have some systems, different sort of systems and organizational information that we apply specifically to the situation that helps that organization view this in a different way, and maybe to construct some interventions that they haven't thought of because they're so caught and embroiled in the particular problems that are happening. They're not taking that bird's eye view of the system's perspective, which we're able to do from our sort of objective place. So we're going to go ahead and talk about what we reported, how we reported back in the individual case studies that we mentioned at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. So in the first case study with the facility that had the leadership turnover, it was a 26-page report. It was a formal report. It was bound. It had table of contents, and it provided a lot of contextual information around the change process, around communication considerations. And in this particular report, we included two addendums, or in the addendums, we had two pieces of information. One was what we call a RACI model, which stands for responsible, accountable, consultative, and informative roles that people have in an organization. And because there was so much ambiguity and lack of clarity, that this was an important piece for them to understand within the organization, clarifying people's roles. So we used this for them as a business example for them to take a look at as a tool as they move forward. The other piece that we included was a business unit triangle, and what that does is it helps them get a visual for where people are at within the organization in terms of their decision making, their time span for getting their work done, and helping them understand what happens when you have people that really are at, for example, a level 3 that are expected to be thinking and planning 3 to 4 years out when they're still performing at a level 1, which could be a day-to-day operational issue, and how that can be disruptive around workflow issues. Anything else you want to add to that one, Patrick?
I would, just because I remember it. I think this was one of the things that I added, so that's probably why I remember it.
Okay.
In terms of the contextual information, I remember us presenting a history of the organization, because a lot of what was happening right now had a lot to do with this series of organizational change that had started years and years before. So we actually wrote sort of an organizational history of their organizational and where they found themselves now in the evolution of this history. So I think we've done that a number of times where we've added sort of a different way of looking at how did we get to this point.
Right. And in this particular case, what was really interesting to your point, Patrick, was that this was a culture that was really steeped in loyalty and relationships. And so they were struggling with moving along that continuum to what we call compassionate accountability. They were becoming more, as they were growing, there was a need for more systems interventions to become a little more bureaucratic. Corporate was having a bigger role in some of the expectations from the facilities. And so part of the context was around what does it mean to go from a relationship-based culture to a performance-based culture and how to manage that process. So that was really key with this particular group in terms of their history. Okay. The second one was, what I wanted to do was I pulled from the table of contents to give you an idea of how in-depth this reporting process can be. So this was a 34-page report that included not only the purpose and the scope of the assessment, what they could expect from the change process, but if you go to I think the 5th bullet point, we had to include organizational theory of managerial hierarchy within a medical field, within group dynamics and subgrouping, helping them understand about tipping point teams and opinion leaders. And the recommendations were comprehensive in that we did them at 3 different levels and helped them understand what they could expect from the criteria and the change process. I would say this is probably one of our more in-depth reports, wouldn't you, Patrick?
Mm-hmm.
And they really needed to have all this information available to understand the complexities when you have different groups, different unions, different partnerships. And this particular group had also a history of a lot of unresolved conflicts and tension and consternation that became endemic in some of the problems that they were experiencing.
One of the things that I remember that came out were that there was a lot of feedback about a couple individuals in the department, not in a leadership position. So more often than not, there will be a lot of feedback that we get for managers or administrators of a department. In this case, there was some specific feedback that came out about a couple individuals and specific behaviors that were problematic. And in this case, I don't think we spelled out that feedback exactly, but we mentioned that there was feedback and that we thought it would be important to get this feedback to those individuals. That's not always the case, but in this particular case, it was so overwhelming.
Yeah.
And so that you'll see again in this case, I think that the reporting back that the data was somewhat secondary to the analysis of what the problems were about to help them put this in a context that allowed them to look at the systems issues and not just bad behavior of people, which is a lot of times what we end up, or the organization's focusing on.
Mm-hmm. And the last one, this was just a one-page summary of strengths and areas of concern specifically from having interviewed the managers. And this was information just so that the owners and the board of directors were able to get their perspective from the managers about what had been going on the last couple of years working with an impaired CEO and and a toxic manager and what they needed to move forward. And so this was, I think 2 pages at most that just highlighted, and they just needed that to be grounded to understand how pervasive and acute the pain was amongst the managers of this practice.
And again, this whole project was very organic and unfolding and didn't fit our usual process. And again, it's important to know when do I need to be adept and not impose a structure that's not going to work for the group. So there was a lot, I'd say, much less formal reporting in this case and much more one-on-one consulting and going to board meetings and real time.
And this also, just very quickly, was a good example where this report, even though it wasn't distributed to anybody but the owners, was being threatened to be used in a lawsuit. Just, I mean, how ironic is that? It was the least formal, the least comprehensive, and yet even this was threatened to be used as part of a lawsuit.
So
all right.
Be careful what you ask for sometimes.
So how long does it take to write a report? This is important for you as a consultant when you start giving your client, or whether it's an internal client or external, some timelines. And so you want to develop a process. And one of the things that Patrick and I really work at is developing a process that will help us identify themes or patterns of behavior. We want to understand what the contributing factors are to the pain and what's the impact, so that when the client is faced with, if I choose to do nothing, what will be the impact of that pain, and what will it cost me to do nothing versus what will it cost me to do something? How can I help alleviate the pain? So whatever your process is, what we have found is that we can come in, get the information, and start to sort of divvy it out, if you will, when Patrick and I work on an assessment together, because we actually do have a process and a formula and a format that we follow most often, right? I would say probably 90% of the time what we do fits in that process. And then it's been our experience that it's about a 1-to-1 hour ratio. So for every hour of interviewing that we do or consulting, that actually translates into about an hour of report writing time. It's a messy process when you're taking individual interviews and pulling out and sifting and identifying patterns and themes of behaviors. It's an arduous process. You have to go back multiple times. And so it does end up taking about, if we're doing a 20 hours worth of interviews, it probably, when all is said and done, by the time we get to the final report, it probably will be about a 20-hour process between writing, editing, marketing, packaging, and getting it to the client. So in our company, we also have what we call the ALHUD 5 draft rule. And it's not uncommon for us to have anywhere from a minimum of 5 drafts. Sometimes we might go up to 7 or 8 drafts before we're actually completed with a report. So we don't expect that. We expect that there will be multiple drafts.
One just real quick thing that I would add, just because this is maybe one of my fonder memories. We've done some of these larger projects with maybe 4 consultants. And the way we typically have started is we sit down in a room and we just debrief. We just unload, because we've sat with maybe as many as 20 to 30 individuals each. And they've unloaded a lot of affect and a lot of pain and emotion. And so for us, as let's say 4 people, just to sit down and to sort of start debriefing that, it's a really important part of the process so that we can start formulating how we're going to begin collapsing the data. And I share that if there's some HR professionals who are doing these kind of reports, important to think about, if you're on your own doing this, you need some place to sort of debrief and unload, because you're getting a lot of affect and you're containing a lot of pain. And that's part of our job, is to help contain that pain. And what we find is that sometimes the assessment process itself begins to help things get better, because people have found a source, at least, that they trust. And we find that people have been able to trust us, and that they've just unloaded, and that's been helpful.
As far as timing for the report in terms of when to give it to the client, the Merlin Plan can be a helpful planning tool. And the premise of that is you begin with the end in mind. And so you think about, is there a specific meeting that we're expected to be able to attend and present the information? And then you can start to go backwards. If we're going to interview 20 people, it's going to probably take 4 days to write a report between edits and getting it to marketing. And so you can start to actually work backwards, and that's what the Merlin Plan is about. The other consideration is we really try to give the client at least 3 days prior to a meeting the report, so they can go over it, they can digest it, they can process it, they can start to formulate their questions. So if we know we're going to have a meeting, we still need to go back at least 3 days prior to that meeting so that they can have the information in a timely way.
So what are some of the challenges that we encounter writing a report? So obviously maintaining a balanced perspective. We did one assessment with a fairly large group of highly intelligent professionals, and one of the, in our pre-briefing meeting, asked us, well, are you going to get to the truth? And it was a really poignant question, and the reality is that we hear as many truths as there are people that we interview. So how do we balance those perspectives in going forward in the report? There's some feedback, some issues that are very difficult, and I think we practice some diplomacy in trying to write that in a way that is going to be best heard, and that takes a lot of time and effort. So when Marcia talks about that one-to-one rule, some of it is actually just the writing, the language, that the psycholinguistics are really important of how we're going to say some of the things we have to say, because sometimes there's some not easy information we're sharing.
You know, the language part is really important because it frames the information. And so when we are interviewing people, they're sharing with us their experiences that are, it's their truth. So sometimes things come across as facts when in fact they're really allegations. And it's important that we use proper wording to clarify perceptions versus actualities. And that takes time as well. And we'll go through multiple versions to make sure that we get it right. Just want to add one thing about writing things that are difficult. It's our job still to be able to put those things in writing and to say them. So we want to say them in a way that the messaging doesn't get in the way of what needs to be said, even if they're difficult things that have to be shared. Understanding how the information will be used is important. You know, sometimes there's unintended consequences around, and there's oftentimes concerns around retaliation or retribution. So we need to be mindful of how this information is being used around decision making, around making changes, and then we want to offer a menu of recommendations, and that means we need to know what's realistic. So we might have a great plethora of ideas, and yet in that particular work environment, there are things that might not fly because of some of the constraints or considerations that they have. So offering a menu of recommendations that attend to the needs that are also realistic.
So before we close, and I promise you we will be closing shortly, we wanted one more poll to make sure you're still all with us. When you think about doing this kind of process, what would be your biggest challenge in putting together the data? So I'm going to see if I can find this and launch our
last and final poll.
What are your biggest challenges in putting together the data? So you have 5 different choices, and we'd just like to kind of see what your thoughts are in your experience, or what would you imagine? Okay, we're getting there. We've got I think 40%. We'll give it another couple seconds, see if anybody else wants to vote. So far, they're condensing and organizing, which is a good vote. Okay, so we've got about 60% now that voted. Another 10 seconds here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this and share this. We got 2 responses, being fair, objective, and even-handed, and condensing and organizing. And this clearly was a trick question. I would say that all of these considerations are our biggest challenge, and more. So I think we kind of teed that up. So making the information clear, making it useful, all of these are huge challenges in what we have to work with. So we are going to just wrap up by teeing up some final considerations and teeing up the last webinar, which is really going to be, you know, now what happens after the report and recommendations. So as Marcia mentioned already, we need to think about this time frame? When are we getting the information back? It's very important for us to meet with the decision makers prior to the full debrief meeting. So we always have a menu of recommendations. We want to find out what is the organization committed to doing about this situation, so that when we go, there can not be a menu of things that aren't going to happen, but that the organization has made some commitment to action. And we'll be talking about that in the next webinar.
It can also be, are they going to mandate that everybody attend the debriefing? Is it optional, voluntary, required? These are things we want to make sure we have a chance to go over. And then for the upcoming and final webinar, we'll be talking about timing, creating an agenda for the meeting. How do you set up the expectations of the staff? And sometimes we'll even write a paragraph or an introduction for the managers to share with their staff about it, meeting with the decision makers, and then anticipating the meeting after the meeting, which is a debriefing with the decision makers of how did that all-staff meeting go and what are the next steps and what do they need from us to help them move forward.
In all of these cases, we have gone ahead and had some intervention and ongoing contact with the department, so we can talk a little bit about our specific recommendations. So we are just at our ending time, so we want to thank you for joining us today. I haven't seen any questions, but feel free. There's both our phone numbers and our email addresses. Feel free, if you want a copy of the PowerPoint, we're happy to send that to you. If you have feedback about the presentation, questions about the next one, please get back to us. And thanks for joining us today.
We look forward to chatting with you in November.